Hello and welcome to the third review of Requests Month 2020. This is Shogun Total War, along with its expansion pack, The Mongol Invasion, for PC. And this review is coming to you courtesy of Fusion Bunny, who sent me a copy of this. Thank you for that, it is greatly appreciated. This is a turn-based strategy game with real-time tactical battles, and the first game in the Total War series. It was developed by the Creative Assembly and originally published by Electronic Arts, although eventually Sega would pick up the rights to the entire franchise and would be publishing it from then on out. The original game was released in 2000, with the expansion following a year later, and both the base game and the expansion pack were generally very well received, with the scale of the warfare being one of the biggest things that people praised about it, although there were certainly some major complaints, mostly centered around technical issues the game launched with, as well as the rather unintuitive interface, and more importantly, the campaign itself, but that's something I'll get to more when I get to the gameplay portion of this. Regardless of complaints people had back when this game was released, however, the game did sell very well, and it ultimately did spawn one of the biggest franchises in strategy gaming. Starting with Shogun Total War, the franchise has had 14 main entries, with the 14th one being Total War Saga Troy, which is slated to come out later this year. But while most people who are familiar with the Total War series are probably familiar with some of the older games in it, like Rome and Medieval 2, they're not really all that familiar with Shogun Total War. So what exactly are we dealing with here? How does this actually set up the franchise that would be? And more importantly, how well does this still hold up? Let's go ahead and start delving right into it and find out. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which was never particularly impressive even in its day as far as raw visual fidelity goes, but the sheer scale of what you're actually seeing was definitely impressive. While you'll certainly see hundreds upon hundreds of soldiers fighting in formation, both on your side and the enemy's side, and you'll see them dying and being left on the battlefield for the remainder of the battle, unfortunately, those are all 2D sprites and they're just extremely low detail, so you can barely even tell what they are most of the time. As if it weren't enough that the sprites are fairly low detail and you can barely tell what they are most of the time, unfortunately they also clash pretty heavily with the 3D rendered environments that you'll actually be seeing the battles take place in. And once you go outside of the battles, you find that everything else is very mixed. The actual strategy map is incredibly unimpressive, with it just being a flat 2D background that's just a map of Japan, and you're moving tokens around on the map as if you would a board game. It is an incredibly bland and boring strategy map, which is one of the major reasons I don't show a lot of it in this review, because it's just not all that interesting and there's really not much to talk about on it, which is something I'll get to more when I get to the gameplay, of course, but we'll get there in a moment. The rest of the visuals are really just composed of a bunch of pre-rendered videos, which are all just 3D animations, and those are taking place in the throne room, which are very basic and very simplistic, and they basically just involve somebody walking into the screen and then bowing and then talking for a bit and then just reversing the process, or they involve your advisor on the left bowing to you and then talking to you for a bit. And that's really it. There's not much to talk about in the throne room section either. But then there are the rest of the pre-rendered videos, which consists of the campaign cutscenes, which are pretty decently done for the era, although they definitely have not aged well considering they're all very low resolution. And then there's the rather quirky set of ninja videos that a lot of people who've played this game will immediately remember as sometimes being fairly silly, where ninja are attempting assassination missions, and often those go horribly wrong. So those do help to give the visuals some personality, but aside from those, there's really not a whole lot going on as far as the visuals are concerned. Sure, the scale is impressive when you get to the actual battles, but those visuals really haven't aged very well, and over the years we've also seen some additional technical problems get introduced with regards to video resolutions and things like that, where the main menu and the throne room both run in 800 by 600 no matter what you do, but you can set the battle maps to run in 1080p, and you're supposed to be able to do that for the strategy map as well, although for some utterly baffling reason I can't get it to select 1080p on Windows 10. It worked just fine on Windows 7, but if I try to get it up to 1080p on Windows 10, for some weird reason it just lists my primary display driver or GTX 1080 as selectable resolution options when that makes absolutely no sense to do so. This is also one of the reasons I don't include a whole lot of strategy map footage, because what I did have that was at 1080p was actually recorded on Windows 7 quite a long time ago, and when I go to record the game on Windows 10 I can get the battles to record at 1080p just fine, but the strategy map just doesn't want to run at anything higher than 1600 by 900 for some baffling reason. Of course that does actually work out, but that's something I'll explain explain a bit more later on. The other big problem with the visuals is that the interface for this game has aged extremely poorly over the years. And a major reason for that is because it just wasn't a good interface to begin with. It was one of the major complaints people had even back when the game was released. And if you go into this now, after especially playing later entries in the Total War series, you're going to be left scratching your head going, wait, what? I'm sure you've noticed by now just from the video footage how bare bones the interface actually is, but it goes beyond simply bare bones. The camera doesn't zoom out far enough during the battle sequences, which makes it rather difficult to see exactly what's going on across the entire battle. You're constantly having to move the camera around to adjust for that, and while that is a problem to some degree in all of the Total War games, it's especially a problem in this one. And keep in mind that on top of fighting the camera, you're also fighting the controls, especially if you played later entries in the Total War series, because the right click actually does not move your units around. It doesn't adjust formations or anything like that like you would expect it to do. It instead opens a contextual drop-down menu. You also don't have any sort of click and drag to select, so you're having to use the control key and click on individual units in the selection down at the bottom to be able to actually select which units you want to move around. It's just a very unintuitive system. And then when you move over into the strategy map, you're also going to be sitting there going, wait, why isn't this doing exactly what I want it to? Because you're probably expecting to be able to click on a unit and then click on a territory to send that unit to, but you can't do that because you have to click and drag it over like it's an actual board game piece. And even aside from just the weird control quirks that the game has, there's also just the interfaces themselves being tucked away in different spots than you would really expect them to be, and the vast majority of the interface just doesn't really get used. And the segments of the interface that do get used are just not all that helpful. Sure, it's pretty easy to just go in and mess around with the construct buildings dialogues as well as the train units dialogues, but for the vast majority of the interface, you're either going to be using it sparingly, or when you are using it, you're probably going to be fighting with it for a while until you finally get used to it. Thankfully, Creative Assembly did take the criticisms for the interface to heart, and they would improve things dramatically in later entries in the Total War series, but that certainly doesn't change how irritating it can be for Shogun Total War. So the visuals for the game are definitely a bit of a mixed bag, but then you move over into the sound design and things are a lot more consistent and they hold up considerably better. The game does allow you to select either English or Japanese voiceovers, and that all works out pretty well, although admittedly I just left the game on Japanese because it's more authentic anyway. And apart from some weird issues with the audio cutoff where a person will be talking and then all of a sudden it'll just abruptly cut what they were saying and go to something else, the voiceovers just generally work pretty well. Then you move over into the sound effects, and they also generally work pretty well, although the strategy map is completely unimpressive because it basically is like a board game. But the battle sounds, at least, are actually rather solid. You've got some pretty nice warfare sound effects in this, although the audio quality is definitely rather low by modern standards, so you will notice some issues with that. Then, of course, there's the soundtrack, which they went out of their way to make sure they were using traditional stylings and traditional instruments for, and that goes a long way to making sure the atmosphere for the game is very much in the time period and the place that it's taking place in. In fact, really the only major problem with the sound design in general is not really a problem with the sound design itself, but rather just the quality level of the files themselves, where the audio quality in those files is just relatively low, and thus it makes this game sound older than it actually is. But when you bring all of the presentation together, it's definitely a very mixed bag. On the one hand, the sound design still holds up pretty well despite the audio quality, but the visuals definitely do not. But of course what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, although there's not much story in this considering that it is a strategy game, and once you get past the intro cutscenes, everything is really just going to play out mostly the same way, where you're ultimately trying to conquer all of Japan. The setup is that this takes place during the historical period in Japan known as Sengoku Jidai, which is the Warring States period. It was a period of roughly 150 or so years, starting in the mid to late 1400s and ending in the early 1600s, where there was massive political upheaval in Japan. You saw the end of the Ashikaga shogunate and ultimately the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate, which would be the final feudal government in Japan before the reformations that would be known as the Meiji Restoration, which would establish the Japanese Empire. It's one of the most fascinating periods of Japanese history and really the perfect time period to set a strategy game in, since it is so heavily inundated with both warfare and political intrigue. This is also the time period that saw the introduction of gunpowder to Japanese warfare, and they took quite quickly to it, so it ends up being this interesting mix of the old and the relatively new as far as warfare goes, and it's in this time of upheaval and change that you'll be leading one of 7 clans to victory in uniting Japan under their banner. These are Clan Hojo, Imagawa, Mori, Oda, Shimazu, Takeda, and Uesugi. And while all of the clans draw from the same unit pool, each one does have one specific unit type that it gets a production bonus to, so they are cheaper to produce and cheaper to upkeep. And for Imagawa, it's ninja, for Mori, it's warrior monks, for Oda, it's Ashigaru, specifically Yari Ashigaru, for Shimazu, it's Nodachi samurai, for Takeda, it's cavalry units, and for Uesugi, it's archers. Clan Hojo's a bit unique because instead of getting bonuses to units, they get a bonus to castles. Specifically, they are cheaper to build and upgrade, so they are more defensive-minded clan. The thing is, aside from these various production bonuses and the specific starting locations on the campaign map, there's not really much difference between any of the clans, and you're going to find that the general experience of playing Shogun Total War is going to be pretty much the same regardless of which clan you're playing. The objective is quite simple: control all of the provinces of Japan. How do you go about doing this? Well, primarily through warfare. You move your armies around the map by clicking and dragging their tokens from one province to another, and ultimately you'll end up fighting a real-time battle there, or you can auto-calc it if you prefer. And once you've defeated the enemy army, you take control of the province. This is a bit different if the province has a castle in it and it has a defensive force stationed there, because in that case you'll need to lay siege to the castle and either wait out the enemy or ultimately overcome their defenses in an all-out assault. Once you take control of a province, you can then construct buildings there as well as train units there if the appropriate buildings have been constructed, and you'll also take in the economic benefits of that particular province. Now, that's measured in a couple of ways. So you have income from harvest, and that is a pretty volatile thing to have, and while you can cultivate farmlands to generally increase it, it is ultimately subject to seasonal changes and things like that. The more steady streams of income are going to be from certain structures that you can only build in certain provinces. These are mines and ports. Neither of these are subject to the same kind of volatility as the harvest, so you'll be wanting to build those in the provinces that support them as soon as possible, and of course you will be wanting to maintain those provinces as much as you possibly can. Regardless of the source you're earning money from, which in this game is called koku, you're going to find that that's the major limiting factor during the campaign, because it's not simply a matter of using koku to construct buildings or train units. You have an upkeep cost for every single unit that you train, whether that be a military unit or an agent, and you need to make sure that the amount of income you're getting is able to support the amount of units that you have. This is of course easier said than done, and you'll need to be conquering provinces at a pretty steady rate to continue to support your armies, especially because the further you get into the campaign, the larger and more powerful of an army you're going to need to maintain, and of course the more powerful units do have higher upkeep costs as well. Of course, military units and buildings are not the only things you're going to be spending your koku on. You're also going to be spending them on various agents that allow you to do all sorts of interesting political things. You can send emissaries to the other factions in order to try to reach diplomatic agreements like alliances, for example, as well as shinobi that you can station in various provinces in order to try to get intelligence on them to see what kind of units are stationed there and what kind of constructions they have, that sort of thing. And they can also cause unrest in a province, making it more difficult for the person who owns that province. And then of course there are ninja, which have all of the same abilities of shinobi, except they cannot create unrest, and instead they get the ability to assassinate enemy leaders, although that is subject to chance, and while successful assassinations will improve the chances that that particular ninja has at successfully assassinating their target, eventually they will probably fail and be executed. This is considerably less of a problem once you unlock geisha, which are basically upgraded ninja in this, and they are much better at successfully assassinating targets than the ninja are, at the cost of being more expensive and also being unlocked pretty late in the game's progression. And speaking of unlocking late in the game's progression, there's also the priest, which is something you only unlock if you convert to Christianity. This is an an option that's given to you once the Portuguese arrive on Japanese shores, and it does come with some pretty hefty downsides, namely there is a ton of civil unrest that is generated from it, and the other daimyo that are still Buddhist do not take kindly to it. But if you do decide to convert, then you gain access to priests, which replace emissaries and can actually combat civil unrest in your territories by just being stationed there, and of course they can also perform all of the diplomatic functions that the emissaries can. But of course the major reason you might consider converting to Christianity in the first place is because the Portuguese offer you guns in exchange. So while it does come at a pretty hefty cost, you do gain access to some rather powerful units. At the same time, if you decide to wait quite a bit longer, then eventually the Dutch will arrive and will offer you guns, but without requiring you to convert to Christianity. But regardless of what units you're training or buildings you're constructing or what provinces you're attacking, the entirety of the grand strategy layer takes place in the turn-based mode, and it's on a very static, very bland, very boring 2D map. It's also severely lacking in depth, with the diplomatic options being extremely limited, as well as the general strategy portion simply being more economic management than anything else. And even then, the economic management in this game mostly just consists of tilling your lands and building certain things, and then just sitting back and waiting for the money to roll in. Aside from that, you might send your ninja or geisha over to assassinate enemy leaders, but that's pretty much it. I mean, the actual spying mechanics are so limited that there's barely anything you can do with them, and causing civil unrest in enemy provinces really isn't as effective as you might hope. All of this combined with the unintuitive interface and the cumbersome controls ultimately make the campaign strategy layer quite tedious to play, and ultimately you'll end up finding that playing the campaigns in this actually ends up being quite boring. It's blatantly obvious that they didn't spend a lot of time and effort developing the campaign strategy layer and focused all of their efforts on the actual battle mechanics, which is where this game really does shine. The battles all take place in real time, and at the time this game was released, the scale was absolutely unprecedented. Units are mostly composed of well over 100 men each, so you're fighting battles with potentially thousands of men on the field all at the same time, all of which are actually shown. And unlike in most strategy games of the time, it's not simply units clashing against one another in just basic real-time strategy combat of whacking each other until hit points go down. Instead, you have a lot of factors going into what determines the outcome of a battle. These vary from things like the actual formation of the units, where you actually have to line them up appropriately to be able to resist charges, or to defend certain areas more effectively, or loosen up the formations to be able to resist arrow fire more effectively, or even put them in more of a wedge formation to assist them in charging an enemy formation. Each unit has its own specific strengths and weaknesses, of course. Some of them are going to be able to brace against cavalry charges more effectively and are going to be more effective against cavalry. Some are going to be more effective against infantry. Some of them are going to be more effective on defense than offense, and you're going to have to make sure that you understand the strengths and the limitations of all of your units in order to succeed at a given battle. In addition, each unit is subject to morale, so as the fight is going their way, then their morale is going to be higher, but if they're losing a battle, then their morale is going to be lower and lower until eventually they are completely broken and will start to rout. And while sometimes a general can rally the troops in order to get them back into the fight, most of the time you're going to find that those units are going to either have to come back on their own or just going to leave the field entirely. Troops with higher morale ratings are going to be able to stay in the fight longer and are going to fight more effectively than troops with lower morale, and in a lot of cases that can make the difference between victory and defeat. Victory, of course, being if you manage to rout all of the enemy forces, or if you manage to completely wipe them out. On top of all of this, you need to pay close attention to the terrain your troops are fighting in, because some of them are going to be more advantageous than others depending on what you're doing. If you're on offense, obviously you don't want to be fighting uphill, whereas if you are on defense, then you want to be on more of an elevated position. If you have archers, you want them to be on an elevated position so they have more range and sight, and you can even conceal your units in tree lines to be able to strike the enemy when they least expect it. And as if all that weren't enough, then it's going to tire your troops out more to charge uphill than downhill for example, so you need to be very mindful of that as well. Your troops will gradually tire out over the course of a battle, and as they tire out, they become less effective, so you do need to be careful and make sure that you're sending in fresh troops when appropriate, and you need to make sure that you're tiring the enemy out more than your own troops are tiring out. And if your troops have seen some combat, but there's a bit of a lull in the fighting, then you can even have them sit and wait for a bit, and they will gradually rest up over time. Even the weather can play a part in how the battle turns out. It's just incredibly impressive how much attention to detail they put into the battle system in this, and more than anything else, that ends up serving as the basis for what made Total War the series it is to this day. And while the AI wasn't exactly the greatest, especially on the strategic layer, but also on the battle layer, it was still capable of putting up quite a bit of a challenge because it was based heavily on the principles of Sun Tzu's Art of War. So it'll do things like take advantage of terrain, or try to get around your flanks and attack you from the sides or behind, or all sorts of things like that, and it does end up making the battles feel very dynamic and just incredibly fun. Despite that, however, the game does suffer from a variety problem. The unit selection is the same across all of the factions. The only difference between them is that some of them get bonuses to production and upkeep of certain types of units, but other than that, everybody has access to the same exact things, which means that everything is ultimately going to be fairly samey very quickly. And of course, there are still the problems of the camera not being zoomed out far enough, the interface itself being very unintuitive, and the controls just generally being pretty cumbersome. So while the battles are tactically deep and are pretty fun when they work, unfortunately you still have to fight with the game to be able to enjoy them. Regardless, the real-time tactical battles are definitely the highlight of Shogun Total War, and the campaign doesn't really serve to do much other than provide some basic context as to why you're fighting a given battle. And while there are 3 stages of campaign available for you to start from, with the basic Sengoku Jidai being the main one, and a bit later on during the Sengoku Jidai being the additional 2, unfortunately the campaigns in this just end up being rather boring, and you're going to find yourself more interested in setting up custom battles or going through the historical battle scenarios, which all have predetermined faction and unit selections to be appropriate for the actual historical battles that they're based on. There was also a multiplayer mode available when the game launched, and while that is still in the game technically, unfortunately you have to go out of your way to get it working now, and it's just not really worth doing when there's later entries in the Total War series that work without much fuss. So the appeal of the base game is definitely a bit limited, and while it does introduce most of the elements that would form the basis for the Total War series to this day, and does also throw in a few mechanics that wouldn't really be used later on, like the honor system, where your generals will gain honor as they get victories and lose honor as they get defeats, and if they take too many defeats and their honor goes too low, then they might commit seppuku. Unfortunately, the game just suffers from the problem of being the earliest entry in the Total War series, and every subsequent entry building on what it originally set forth. I mean, to give you some context, my first foray into the Total War series was with Rome Total War, and even by that point, it was a far and away more advanced game than this, and going back to this feels archaic even compared to that, and that was only 2 games later. And the expansion pack for Shogun Total War, which was the Mongol invasion expansion, didn't really help matters all that much. I mean, sure, it does introduce a brand new campaign that's set about 300 years prior to the events of the main Sengoku Jidai campaign, where you can play as the Mongol horde as they try to invade and take control of all of the provinces of Japan, and with that comes the Mongol horde faction with its own specific selection of units that are separate from all of the Japanese units that you would normally encounter, but unfortunately the mechanics of that campaign are just frustrating to deal with. Unlike in the base game where you train your units up by conquering provinces and then actually training the units within those provinces, to replenish your troops as the Mongol horde you have to rely on shipments of units from the sea. And to get those shipments of units, you basically have to win battle after battle to be able to impress the Khans back home, and thus they'll send you more units to continue your conquest with. In theory, that's an interesting twist, but in practice it means that you'd never really feel like you have enough troops to be able to maintain holdings and continue your onslaught on the various provinces, because you're going to be constantly going up against very large armies, and you'll be losing troops at a pretty high rate because most of the ones you have have are actually pretty squishy. Sure, the Mongol light and heavy cavalry can be absolutely devastating, but the infantry is all Korean conscripts that don't want to be there and are not very well equipped. Surely you can apply the right tactics to make it work, but more often than not it's just frustrating to deal with and makes the Mongol invasion campaign just incredibly annoying. But at least it gives you a new selection of units you can mess around with in the custom battles and the historical battles, so there is that. And if you get the game digitally these days, then it is the Gold Edition which has the Mongol invasion expansion included, so you're not paying anything extra for it. But I have a really hard time justifying the purchase of the expansion on its own if for whatever reason you only had the base game. The thing is, while I have a hard time justifying the purchase of the expansion on its own, I also have a problem justifying the purchase of the base game. This is a really difficult game to go back to if you've played any of the more recent games in the Total War series, just because of the control issues in the interface, let alone how simplistic it is compared to all of the later games in the series. And when the series returned to this time and place with the release of Shogun 2, there was basically no real reason to go back to the original Shogun to begin with. These days it's definitely interesting to take a look back on as the genesis of the Total War series and see how things have changed and improved over time, but it's not really the kind of game I can recommend going back to, even if you are a die-hard fan of the Total War series. But if you do decide to take a look at it despite my recommendations, I will still have a link in the video description box where you can pick this up on Steam. It is the Gold Edition, which includes both the base game and the Mongol invasion expansion, and it is updated to run properly on modern systems, although it does still have some weird technical issues here and there. Just make sure you understand what you're getting yourself into before you do decide to delve into it. Thank you for watching, and if you like the kind of videos that I make, then please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Every cent that goes into that goes directly back into the channel in some way, whether that be getting additional games for review, or additional equipment, or whatever the case may be. If you can't do so or don't want to, then that's perfectly fine, I understand, but every bit does help. Thank you all again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.